There's a lot of talk these days about skinwalkers. Now, this is an ancient legend from the Diné Navajo culture about an evil sorcerer who can turn himself into a wolf or another animal and go out to do evil. And these days, in the horror community and the paranormal community, it seems like everyone's talking about skinwalkers. Just go on YouTube. You can find scores and scores of videos, stories of people telling supposedly firsthand accounts of their encounters with skinwalkers out in the mountains of New Mexico. There are documentaries. The History Channel's done series about them. Even J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author, she mentions them in one of her recent writings about the wizarding world. But I'm here to tell you my own true story about skinwalkers. It's a firsthand account as it was told to me when I was in New Mexico. You see, out in a remote town somewhere in New Mexico, somewhere on the Navajo Diné territory, the tribal police, they were called up to go out to a woman's house. The woman's neighbors had heard screaming coming from the house and they called the police. Now, when the police went out there, they noticed that the window was broken. It was a traditional Hogan style house, a circular stone house, and they saw the window was smashed. But they walked up, there was a fresh new fallen snow around the house. And as they walked up slowly, they noticed that there were no footprints in the snow. Well, there were no human footprints in the snow, but they saw the footprints of a large wolf circling around the house right up to the window. They went up and they checked the door. The door was open. They knocked. Nobody answered. So they pushed the door, creaked open. They walked in. They called out in the Diné language. Nobody answered. It seemed like it was deserted, but they looked and there was just a disaster in that house. Broken plates and dishes. Everything was torn to bits. The curtains around, fluttering around that broken open window, the curtains are all torn to shreds. They looked everywhere. Finally, they saw under the bed the old woman who lived there. She was huddled under the bed, curled up, shaking with fear, terrified. They brought her out and they gave her some tea and they asked her what had happened. And then she told them. She said she'd been sitting there in bed, just sitting there reading the Bible late at night. And she was startled by the sound of the glass breaking. And she looked up and she saw with terror a huge gray wolf crashed in through the window, was pacing back and forth in front of her bed, staring at her, growling. And then she said that huge gray wolf looked at her and transformed back into his natural form, and it was her nephew. She said her nephew, he had always been a skinwalker. He had developed those powers and used them to go out and do evil, and she didn't know when he might come back again. And that's the true story, just as I heard it firsthand. Well, kind of. All right. I didn't hear it from the woman who experienced it, or from the tribal officers, or from the neighbor, or from anyone who even lived on the Navajo Nation for that matter. I heard this story through a filter of a filter of a filter. I heard it from a teenage California girl who just happened to be living in New Mexico. She was the daughter of evangelical missionaries who were working in the region. And it came to her through all these filters, and then it came to me. You see, I'm actually not here primarily to tell you that story. I'm here to talk about how we deal with those sort of stories. I want to tell my own story of when I heard that Skinwalker story and of the scary things that I experienced at the time. And ultimately, this is a story about the way that we take those stories, those of us who are not native, the way that we hear those stories and often distort them, reinterpret them. Stories like the Skinwalker, and we reinterpret and distort them often through the lens of our own stories and of the legends that we've grown up with. You see, I heard that story when I was in high school. It was the 1990s. And I was in New Mexico on a trip with my church from California. The church would send the teenagers, the youth group, we would go out to this little Bible college out near Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it was a college that worked with the native people. They were the students of the college and teenage volunteers. We would go out and we would do volunteer work on the Bible college, manual labor and upkeep. Well, we were out there on this youth group trip, and that particular summer, something came over our whole group that we couldn't explain. There was a strange, the only way I could describe it was a kind of a darkness. This dark mood fell over everyone in our group. And as the days went on, it just, whatever it was, it seemed to bring out the worst in us, in every one of us, whatever their personality was. The stubborn people became more stubborn, and the angry people became more angry. The cool kids in the youth group, they got more cocky, more cruel toward the kids who were not the cool kids. And one of my close friends, I remember he fell into a depression. He was hoping that his spirits would be lifted because his birthday was that week. He was waiting for a call from a close friend back home, and she forgot to call. So all of us went into this dark, sour mood. All the youth leaders, they lost patience with us teens and our antics. And on top of that, strange things were happening. Objects disappeared and they got misplaced. One night, the youth leaders, they went into the kitchen and dining area and they found all the ice cream sandwiches from the freezer had just been all tossed out and scattered on the floor. Nobody had even eaten them. They confronted all of us about it. Nobody took responsibility for it. People started to whisper to each other. We started to feel like there was a cloud hanging over us, a darkness, something like an evil presence. And then one night, we were sitting on the bunk beds in the gym at that old Bible college. We were sitting there and we started chatting with this girl. We'll call her Katie. She was the daughter of the missionaries who ran the place. And she started telling us about this legend of the Skinwalkers, of these evil sorcerers who could turn into an animal. She told us it was real. She told us her parents were sure it was real. And when she told us that story sitting in the gym, we heard the story of the old woman and of the skinwalker coming in, crashing in through the window and attacking her. And Katie told us that the reason the skinwalker had attacked the old woman was because the old woman, she had joined the church and he didn't like her new faith. He wanted her to follow the old ways. Now, we heard this version of the skinwalker legend from a person who was not Diné, not Navajo, not native. And all of us, we understood it according to the stories that we had all told. So we believed it was true because we believed that things like evil spirits could be true because of the stories that we'd grown up hearing. So we were terrified. Katie left us in the bunk beds and we were sitting there in the dark gym. And one of the big guys from our group, he had to shower that night. We could hear him singing Kumbaya in the shower, terrified out of his wits, afraid of something evil being out there. And we were sure that was why we had all been in such a bad mood. That was why all of us had reverted to just the worst of our own personalities. That must be why there must be an evil presence, something demonic. And it must be because of all the latent paganism that existed. That was how we interpreted it. Now, you can't blame all of it on the religious leaders that we had. See, that's a very common way to talk about indigenous traditions in our own pop culture. It's unfortunately common. We see this all the time in horror movies, in books, in TV shows, all too often when they depict indigenous traditions of the Americas, of Africa, of Asia, of anywhere else, anything that's not part of the Abrahamic faiths, all too often they're depicted as, well, evil. And then we had extra reasons to think that way because we had been told that when missionaries go to a new place, that those missionaries face the opposition of these evil forces, of evil spirits. And missionary work was often described in militaristic terms as a beachhead going into hostile territory. Now, I don't need to tell you about the long, dark history behind that narrative being used on native land in the Americas. And sometimes it came along with actual violent military action. Now, the reality is, most likely the reason that all of us were in such a sour mood is that we were tired. We had just taken a big trip. We were working out under the hot New Mexico sun. Some people probably got food poisoning. Nobody was in their best state. Nobody was being their best version of them. But at the time, we heard the story of the Skinwalker and we interpreted it according to all of our own stories. Now, the story of the Skinwalker, it's a real story in the Diné Navajo tradition. This is a real legend that goes back centuries, millennia. It's known as the Ye Nad Loshi in the Navajo language. It's a real story, but the thing is, most of us who are on the outside will never hear the real version of it. This is a story that comes to us through filters and filters. Those of us on the outside, we cannot hear it clearly. If you look at those YouTube videos, those creepy pasta stories, well, you just need to listen to them and you can tell that most of their authors, if not all of them, are not Navajo. They're not native. Most of the stories they read like your typical modern urban legend, a car breaking down on the roadside and a monster, something comes up and attacks the people in the car. They barely make it out with their lives. It's like The Hook. It's like The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It's like all those stories just substituting in the word Skinwalker. There's a place in Utah called Skinwalker Ranch that takes it to new extremes. Now, for a lot of people these days, the word Skinwalker and that ranch, they're almost synonymous. But the phenomena that people associate with that ranch and that the History Channel, they did a whole series about it, all that phenomena, well, it's nothing more than just modern US paranormal culture. People talk about UFOs and Bigfoot and ghosts and crop circles and poltergeist activity. This is not the original native story we're hearing. Now, I don't know if there is such a thing as witchcraft or evil spirits in an objective sense. It's not my place to say. But I am certain of one thing. There isn't more evil in some places just because native traditions exist and are alive in those places. Indeed, to suggest so is itself evil, I believe. And as for the Skinwalker legend, for those of us on the outside, it remains a mystery. Like many ancient traditions in the Diné Navajo world, it's not customary to share them with outsiders. They are simply not ours to know.